Hi everyone, my name is Angela and this is going to be my October reading wrap up. I read 6 books in the month of October. I didn't quite read as much as I wanted to because one, I was on vacation in California and it wasn't the kind of vacation where we were like lounging by a pool and had a lot of downtime. It was more of a like sightseeing vacation where we were like moving around all day and going to different places. That's one factor, and the other is that I got really obsessed with Baldur's Gate 3, which is very odd for me. I'm not like a gamer girly, but I'm obsessed with this video game, so I spent many hours playing that. But let's get into the books. The first book I finished in October is The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter by Theodora Goss. This book has a lot going on. It is historical fantasy. It has a strong found family trope. It has mystery in it, and it also has characters from Victorian literature. So we have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we have Shakespeare and we have Sherlock and Dr. Watson, we have Rappaccini, we have Dr. Moreau and Frankenstein, and our main character is Mary Jekyll, and her father is of course Dr. Jekyll. And at this point in the story, her parents have both passed away, and after her parents' death, she realizes that her father's friend Edward Hyde might actually be nearby, and he is actually a convicted murderer, and there's like a reward for his capture, and she is very broke at this point, so she is trying to solve this mystery of, is Edward Hyde nearby, and if he is, can I catch him and get the reward? And along this journey she meets a bunch of other girls who are all related to these like famous Victorian literature figures in some way or another, and a lot of these characters have to do with like science fiction and experimentation and things like that, so it's very interesting looking at like science and ethics and how all of that has affected these young women. I gave this book 5 stars. I really loved it. I listened to the audiobook. Sometimes I followed along with my eyes, but I just thought that this was so charming and entertaining and fun, and I just enjoyed every moment of it. I'm actually really glad that I read this before I read Dracula, because there were a lot of references to Dracula that I completely missed, and it was really fun like to read Dracula and be like, oh, that was what that was. So I would highly recommend this if you like historical fiction and mystery and found family. Like, I just think it's so fun, especially if you love any of those like Victorian characters, you know, like if you love the book Frankenstein or if you love Sherlock Holmes. I think this one will really work for you. Next up, I read A Grave Robbery by Deanna Raybourn. This is book number 9 in the Veronica Speedwell series. If you don't know what the series is, we basically follow our main character Veronica, who is a lepidopterist, which means she is like a butterfly scientist. She gets involved in this like kidnapping murder plot in our first book and gets thrown in with these new characters, and now she and her friend Stoker are often getting into trouble and solving these mysteries and getting involved in these weird cases of crime and strange things happening in Victorian London. And so this is the 9th installment, and it has to do with a grave robbery. I don't want to say too much about this book, but yeah, it's basically a historical mystery series set in the Victorian era in London, and we have a very slow burn romance in this series, and it's written very intelligently with a lot of witty banter and a lot of talk about science. I gave this one 3.5 stars. I feel like most of the later books in the series are just like good, enjoyable, but not anything mind-blowing for me, but I will always continue to listen to these on audio when they come out and highly recommend the series. I just don't think any of the books are ever going to be like 5 stars again, and that's okay. Next up, I continued a fantasy series that is probably one of the most hyped fantasy series on the internet, and that is Mistborn Book 2, The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson, of course. And in this world, our magic system has to do with ingesting metals and using metals to have certain powers and abilities that normal people don't. And if you have this ability to use metals, you can either use all of them, which is very rare, or you can use just one of them and have one very specific power. Our first book was very much a story about overthrowing an empire and freeing people from oppression, taking back control over the land that has been ruled by this horrible autocratic leader for 1,000 years. I gave this book 4 stars. I also gave the first one 4 stars, so they're just like very solid fantasy stories for me. I really enjoyed them. I've said this before, but Brandon Sanderson has the best endings. The last like 100, 150 pages of his books that I've read at least, which is only 2, but they tend to be just like completely action-packed, and you get so many answers to questions that you've had, or reveals, or information that completely changes the way that you look at the world or certain characters or the story. It took me a little bit to get into this, which is why it wasn't a higher rating, but I thought the ending was great, and ultimately I think his plots are really entertaining and engaging, and I had a really great time with this one. Next up, I read Model Home by Rivers Solomon. This is a horror novel, and I wanted to read this because it was October, Halloween. I'm not really a Halloween girly, I'm just more of like an autumn girly, but I wanted to read at least one horror book this month. I would describe this book as a social horror with a haunted house element, but I think if you go into this expecting like a fun, scary, haunted house story, you're going to be sorely disappointed. This is a really dark, heavy, complex story about a Black family living in this really like nice gated suburban community, I think in Texas. Yeah, in Texas. And in the present day, we are following our main character Esri, and they are going back to their home in Texas, and when they arrive, they find their parents dead in their home in a very gruesome way. And the way that this kind of presents itself to the world is that it was a murder-suicide, but Esri and their siblings know something that everyone else doesn't, which is that their home has always been haunted by some sort of supernatural entity that was torturing them. And so we're following these siblings reflecting on their past, dealing with the present reality that their parents were most likely killed by this supernatural entity. We have a lot of conversations about why Esri's parents chose to stay in this house. Like I said, they live in a very nice neighborhood, and they are the only Black family in this neighborhood. They might even be the only non-white family in this neighborhood, I think. And so the house is very much a symbol of the parents' success and getting to the point in their lives where they have enough money for this very nice house and to provide for their children in a way that they didn't have when they were younger. There are also discussions of sexuality and autism. There are a lot of complex sibling dynamics in this story, conversations about gender. Definitely look up trigger warnings if there's anything that you don't feel comfortable reading about. It might be in this book. I think some of the trigger warnings that I could give would be kind of spoilers for the direction that this story goes in, but I mean, if you're like, oh, I can just read anything, like fine, but if there's literally anything that you do not want to read about, I would encourage you to go to Storygraph and check the content warnings. I gave this book 3.75 stars. I read this as a combination of like audio and the physical book from my library. I thought this was very well written. I like social horror. I'm not much of a horror reader, and when I do read it, I really want it to have a social component. This is a rather short book, and I was engaged or entertained or interested for every single moment of this book. There was never a moment where I was bored or that I thought the story was pointless or stupid. So yeah, this one worked for me. It's just not my favorite type of book. It's not my favorite genre. So this book was probably never going to be a 5-star, but I thought it was really well done, and I would highly recommend it if you want to read a social horror. I just don't go into it expecting it to be like a fun, campy, haunted house book, because that is not what it is. Next up, I finally read a book that I've had on my shelves since like 2022. It is probably the most beautiful book I own, and that is Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is possibly the most famous vampire novel, as we know, and we are following our main character. Actually, no, we're not following our main character. We're essentially following a group of characters who all get involved with Dracula in some way or another. They have been affected by him, or they know about him, and essentially we are following the journey of figuring out that Dracula is behind these things and then trying to capture him and stop all the evil plots that he has going. I won't speak too much on this because I did put this in a vlog, but this was very plot driven. I was pleasantly surprised by that, but I think at some point it just got too repetitive and I was a bit bored with the plot, even though it was plot driven. So I enjoyed this and I gave it 3.5 stars. I think this is a great classic for beginners and a great classic to read if you just like really love vampire stories, because I think it delivers. It was creepier than I expected. And then finally, my last book of the month was The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I also gave this book 3.5 stars. This was quite a disappointment, even though 3.5 stars is still like a good rating. I loved The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt so much that I expected this to be a 5 or 4 star just because everyone raves about this book and it is like the progenitor of dark academia books. We are essentially following a fucked up friend group at this prestigious liberal arts college in Vermont, and on the very first page you find out that someone is murdered, and so you're kind of going back in time and seeing how they get to this place where one of their friends is dead. And I don't know, I just thought this was really meandering and boring in parts and just a little pointless. I didn't feel like the characters were real people, they just felt like dark academia caricatures. In no way could these characters exist in real life, at least that's how I felt when I was reading this. They were so just bizarre. So I know a lot of people really do love this book and I would still recommend it. I still enjoyed parts. I mean, it's so detailed, the writing is great, and there were a lot of interesting themes and discussions. I wish we had gotten more of their Greek classes, honestly. They're studying Greek and reading all the, you know, all of Homer and stuff like in the original Greek, which is so cool. But yeah, didn't quite live up to the hype, but I still enjoyed it, so I'll take that as a partial win. Those are all the books I read in October. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more bookish content from me, and I hope you have a lovely week.